Committee Room 4, sound. 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 Committee Room 4, Sound.
Broadcasting. So we okay to
we're ready.
get started. If you're okay, Home Secretary.
Yes, thank you very much.
5, 4. Good morning. Good morning to the Home Secretary, to the committee. Welcome to the first of what I hope will be regular and frequent meetings with you, Home Secretary. Our remit is both justice and home affairs, and there's an awful lot in both areas to talk about. Welcome to Tricia Hayes, the understand second permanent secretary. Our questions are policy questions, and I'm sure that you understand that. Of course, if there are technical matters, then we understand you will want to bring your official in. Shall we just get started?
Let's give it a go.
Let's give it a go. Right. We wanted to start with asking you about refugees and integration. You've been quoted quite a lot in press releases and otherwise, and in a press release announcing the Operation Warm Welcome, talking about the importance of integration, something we'd share and something that we know is important for people coming from anywhere, including Hong Kong, for instance. Can you tell us what the integration programme will entail?
Of course. Well, Baroness Ham, we thank you, and good morning to the committee, and thank you for this opportunity. I think really there are a number of points that I would like to make around resettlement of those that we bring to the United Kingdom, and I'd like to just sort of put this within the context. First of all, of Afghanistan, where we have brought people over. We have evacuated 15,000 people, many of whom, by the way, are British nationals as well. But those that we've evacuated, we are committed to their resettlement, and we don't hold the view that they are refugees. These are people, obviously, who have a bond to our country through a lot of the work that they've done over 20 years, basically in supporting, quite frankly, rebuilding Afghanistan, civil society, all of that, and we're all familiar with that background. Then, of course, we have the wider piece around refugees, and I'm sure Baroness Hamwee, the committee, is familiar with the work we've done on BNOs, for example, and people from Hong Kong. Those who are basically fleeing persecution, suffering oppression. But if I may, just on Afghanistan, first of all, which has been challenging, we should be under no illusions about how difficult this has been. We obviously had Op Pittin, which was an incredible operation, and as a Secretary of State that worked in the department 24/7, along with some, I have to say, our incredible officials, along with colleagues in the MOD, we were night and day on the evacuation. We also knew that we had a duty of care and a responsibility to those that we were evacuating. But you've asked about the resettlement, what does that consist of? It's taken time, but it consists of a number of key component parts. First of all, it's welfare and accommodation. The trauma, the sheer trauma of being evacuated, and it's our department actually and our colleagues in the MOD, I think it would bring tears to your eyes basically to hear how harrowing the tales were in terms of what I call the lift and shift operation, getting people through processes, security checks on a plane, etc. Children as well, young children. And I've been to Heathrow many times to be there, receive them, and just talk to them as well. So the welfare support has always been front and centre. A place, a roof over their heads. So it is a fact we've put people in hotels for two reasons. One was for the quarantine purpose. COVID, we are living with COVID. So COVID has been the backdrop for the hotel accommodation, quarantining, and then keeping people in hotels. But while they've been in hotels, welfare support has been put in place. Financial support has been put in place, and if I may, this isn't all Home Office as well, this is across government. So we have been the sort of coordinators doing the dot matrix of joining things up. But with that, also education support for children, and with DWP in particular, looking at jobs and skills, how we can start to really match people up with their skills to employment. So I can even speak just on Afghanistan around the distribution of the 15,000 people nationwide. We have a majority of them in London, and obviously with that there is a lot of cross-government work, which is why it's called Operation Warm Welcome, in terms of other government departments coming together to provide the support. that is needed, but it's long term. None of this, changes overnight people's circumstances. And then Baroness Hamley, with that, we are then in the process with the new Levelling Up Department, which was the former Ministry for Local Government and Housing, in terms of working with local authorities who've been given financial support to effectively match people up, families up, to then give them permanent accommodation. That is challenging for a number of reasons. Accommodation, homes are in short supply, but also the right type of homes, particularly with large families too.
Right, thank you. I mean, there's so much that's needed, as we all recognise. I understand that Germany supplies 600 hours for each refugee on language and orientation. France is 200. There are all sorts of obstacles that, personal, individual ones, that in where the lessons or classes, whatever, are provided, it's much harder for women to get to them because men assume the women will stay home with the children. The men can access the integration programs. How are we going to make sure that the programs are available to everyone? For instance, very specifically, childcare being made available. So
well, I think that's right.
Real access.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I don't think any of us in this room would dispute the fact that access should be for everybody, men and women. That is clearly our objective, but I'll be very, very candid right now. While we have people accommodated in hotels, the logistics and the infrastructure for providing support is challenging. Okay. I'm very, very honest about this.
But
until we can settle people,
well ahead.
So absolutely. So until we can settle people into, what will be their new communities where they can rebuild their lives or restart their lives. I mean, I look at this from the lens of restarting their lives, which means, first of all, for children, making sure children are in school. So a good example of this, I mean, there are plenty of discussions taking place, and if you forgive me, I'm not leading all these discussions. We have a minister for the resettlement scheme who is leading this work. But education is a very, very good example. So the Department for Education right now are very clear that they have identified where there are places in schools where they want the children who have been obviously with these evacuated families who are in the United Kingdom, in the UK, in England and Wales in particular, to go into school. From that basis, that then gives stability, and then of course we can start working with the parents in terms of access to language, access to skills training, and then of course that leads to the next foundation, which is access to employment. So there are, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues, I'd be very happy in future to come back and explain how this comes together. But these are early days, and in all honesty, we are not at the stage where we can say component A, B, C are leading to the following outcomes just yet. It does not mean that work is not taking place. There is extensive work taking place across the whole panoply of government.
Perhaps we can leave it with a request that that sort of detail will enable women not to be in the position where they're relying on children to interpret for them. Baroness Kennedy.
Home Secretary, I wanted to commend the department on the work that you've just described, which is quite extraordinary. I've been working on getting women judges and lawyers out of the country, and I think you might know a little bit about that work. We've now got 103 women out, women judges, and of those, there are something like 80 women judges and their families waiting in Athens. And of course, I'm operating on a global scale, but I wanted to ask this. If I were able to secure, for example, academic posts here in the UK for some of those very accomplished women judges, would that facilitate and expedite applications if they were offered jobs so that they were coming here as skilled and, if you like, talented people?
So, well, thank you for raising this, and I'm aware of the women judges in Athens as well. I've actually spoken to the Greek immigration minister about this just this week. I think it's important to just put some context around, first of all, we have brought over the evacuation. evacuation was always our priority, clearly, in terms of moving people out. And then post-evacuation, we do have a scheme, clearly, which is the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which, is one of the most ambitious in the world. We are not able to operationalise that scheme. Just think about the discussion we've just had. We simply do not have the infrastructure in terms of accommodation. In fact, when I announced the scheme, I made it quite clear we had to be assured, almost like the Syrian resettlement scheme as well, that we could bring people over, and when we did, they would have accommodation, they would have jobs to go to. And this is basically our thinking in terms of how we work going forward. So I think the short answer is yes, clearly. I mean, these are accomplished people. They are skilled individuals. They are professional people. Why would we not want to bring them over? Plus, we have to think about their safety and security in light of the regime that we know about in Afghanistan. It is, however, a case of actually following this through, ensuring that we have all the various connections. So there are other examples you would have seen, for the most recent one, the Afghan female football team, sponsored, of course, by teams in the UK. We still have a duty of care to them in terms of accommodation, the wider resourcing that goes with that, which is why we are looking at everything on a case-by-case basis right now. And my final comment on this is simply not a Home Office decision as well. This actually cuts across the Foreign Office in terms of those who we would seek to bring into the United Kingdom in terms of leave outside the rules as it currently stands, and then how we would bring them over. And there is this very, very difficult and sensitive issue. I appreciate the judges are in Athens right now. Yes. You all know of the journey that they've had to get to Athens. It is not straightforward. And that in its own right, I still think we have to think about threat to life, the risk to them all, and how we can ensure that we're safeguarding them in the right way and not putting them at greater risk.
Thank you very much.
Let's move on to immigration, on which we have a number of questions. The new plan for immigration, you've explained that the return of asylum seekers, inadmissible asylum seekers, is contingent on securing returns agreements with safe third countries. Could you update us on the plans to secure return agreements?
Well, let me do that, of course. First of all, the new plan for immigration, the premise of the policy itself is for fundamental reform of an asylum system, and I'm very, very conscious Lord Blunkett is here as well, who will completely understand the trials and tribulations around asylum policy over not just recent years but decades as well, and how we process cases. The point about the new plan for immigration is introducing, particularly around claims and appeals, an expedited process. But for those who have no legal basis to stay in the United Kingdom, we absolutely want to return them to their own country. And with that, of course, again, I'd just like to emphasise this. We have put our legislation and policies together. We are working on returns agreements and dialogues. We are removing people and returning people. Literally, and we've been doing this through a pandemic, which has been very, very difficult for all the obvious reasons I don't need to unpack right now. In terms of returns agreements, the most significant returns agreements that we have had thus far, number one is with India, which is part of a migration agreement deal that I struck with India earlier on this year. And India is significant because they are one of the largest countries where we have the highest number of Indian nationals who have no legal basis to be in the United Kingdom. So that effectively means we are now working with them on charter flight removals to India, and that is work directly government to government. And then the second country where we have negotiated a returns agreement is Albania. And Albania for a very, very good reason, because we have the highest number of foreign national offenders in our prisons who tend to be from Albania. And also we have people from Albania entering our country illegally through various routes. More prominently right now is small boats, where we are seeing a lot of Albanian nationals actually coming to our country illegally. So these are significant returns agreements. There's work taking place with other countries as well. And at the same time, Baroness Hanway, it would be remiss of me not to just touch upon EU member states. I recently hosted the G7 in September, where we are in active discussions with, for example, France. We have a lot of work taking place with France on small boats, illegal migration. It's a really big problem, and it's a joint problem. But with that, of course, there are other countries in the EU which returns agreements clearly are now becoming much more of a wider topic within EU member states, and a recognition that we all need to work together in this space.
In the policy document, the suggestion is made that countries which don't cooperate on taking returnees, if I can call them that, there might be a sanction by controlling the issue of visas. Is the problem not really about the safety of the place where people might return? Is this an appropriate method of securing a workable system?
Well, I think on this point, and it is an important point, we are effectively alluding to visa sanctions with countries that do not cooperate in taking back their own nationals. We should emphasise these are their own nationals, which is not an unreasonable position to take, whereas many countries themselves are constantly, I mean, this is part of foreign policy and diplomacy as well. You know, can you please open up your visa waivers, for example, to us as a country? But this is right that we have these dialogues with countries, and it's not just about returns agreements. It's also making sure that they themselves are actively taking back their own nationals. But you've asked a question very specifically about the safety of these countries. We have very clear laws and rules in place around, you know, the type of countries where we would remove or return people to, including own nationals. These countries have to be safe. They have to have a strong record in terms of human rights. And our policies are all predicated on that basis as well. So all our actions are legal. But at the same time, I think it's right that we have these bilateral discussions, country by country. We have a very, very significant list of countries where they are very slow at taking back or accepting their own nationals. And it's right that we pursue in an active way these dialogues with many of these countries.
I think I'd better keep moving on. There's a lot to talk about there. You've trailed Lord Blunkett's intervention, so Lord Blunkett.
Home Secretary, thanks for making time for us. Yes, I do remember very well appearing before select committees using very much the same sort of language that you're using. And could I make it clear that I think all of us understand that we want to clamp down on organised criminality in terms of trafficking. It's a given. So the question is, how do we do it? The UNHCR have suggested that the new immigration policy threatens to create discriminatory two-tier asylum system. I just thought, to begin with, whether you'd just like to comment on that.
I would, absolutely. And we are working, for the benefit of the committee, we are working with UNHCR. They are very, very important partners for us. Let me just be very clear about that. And I myself have professional history working with UNHCR as well in terms of previous roles that I've held in government. And they are absolutely an incredible organisation. And if I may, just coming back to the discussion we had on Afghanistan, they're a partner with us in the work that we do. I would actually characterise our approach as a differentiated approach, which is one to deter illegal entry to the United Kingdom by those with the ability to pay people smugglers. And Lord Blunkett, this goes back to your original point about organised crime. Perhaps as Home Secretary, I see organised crime and criminality and people trafficking and people smuggling now through a much more intensive lens. But the scale of which we see organised criminality is absolutely appalling, it's abhorrent and it's shocking. And it's not just in France, it is across the whole of the EU, but it's also even further afield. And I say this from my former days as DFID Secretary of State. Go to the Sahel, go to Africa, go to various other countries. We have a fundamental problem around people trafficking. So I believe that in terms of our differentiated approach, it's absolutely justified. It's proportionate because it seeks to uphold the commitments of all countries. I believe when it comes to protecting the vulnerable, we all believe in protecting vulnerable people. And at the same time, when we think about our wider work, which now sits with FCDO, investment, economic development, upstreaming, all that work, that's vital. But The crucial thing for us, and I say this obviously as Home Secretary, which very much is the work that we do with law enforcement. And Lord Blunkett, you've asked, how do we deal with criminality and organised criminal gangs? It is through the very strong systems that we have that you will also be familiar with. National Crime Agency, intelligence partners, prosecution pathways, the way we actually use much of our surveillance activities, our drones, our footage basically, when we are working with third countries like France, AMPR, where we are actively using these tools to basically hone down on these gangs. And we do have, I don't have the figures with me today, but we have had a number of successful prosecutions year on year. And the other point to make about the new plan for immigration is that we will toughen the penalties and the sanctions, the consequences for these people smugglers, because currently right now the criminal justice system is just too soft when it comes to sentencing of these people.
Thank you very much. I think we all take the point, as we did a moment or two ago, about the importance of what we used to call the Gateway Programme. You renamed it with the UN, and that applies to Afghanistan as it does to separately to what we're doing with Hong Kong. I'd just like to try and get a little more granular, because I still don't understand the admissibility issue. So maybe I could just ask you this to start with.
Yeah.
Is admissibility based on those who come with legitimate documentation, passport and legitimate documentation through what we would describe as legitimate routes, i.e. they come by air from a third country or by ship, by legitimate purchase of a travel arrangement? Is that where people are admissible for asylum claims?
No, so there are, if I can just speak about the sort of wider changes that have taken place around immigration. So we have our legal routes, clearly. We have the legal system of coming to the United Kingdom, which Lord Blunkett is all about, legal routes, documentation, showing that you've got your visas, all of that absolutely is the right and proper way. Inadmissibility is very much about those who enter our country illegally without documentation. And the point of inadmissibility, let's not forget, if we were to look at, for example, small boats or people being smuggled in the back of lorries, they have not come literally through danger. I mean, dangerous means clearly through coming through boats and lorries and just in the hands of criminals. But they've actually travelled through safe countries, safe third countries, where they could and should have claimed asylum if they are asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution and who are suffering serious threat to life. What we are seeing, and all the data and evidence has shown this, so in the last 12 months alone, 70% of those individuals that have come to our country illegally via small boats are single men who are effectively economic migrants. They are not genuine asylum seekers. They are literally elbowing because they're able to pay the smugglers, they're able to get in contact with the gangs, whether it's in northern France or actually in Germany. These are the ones that are elbowing the women and children who are basically at risk and fleeing persecution. And so the admissible route around asylum is very much about how we work with third parties such as UNHCR, such as IOM, to effectively create safe and legal routes. And that is where we are concentrating our efforts around asylum and creating safe passage for genuine refugees.
I won't keep you because other people have got questions relating to this, but can I just try and find a way of understanding how, apart from the work with the UNHCR, which we're all fully aware of and fully supportive of, how does someone claim asylum if they've got a passport, a visa and a legitimate route from their country? How do they claim that they are persecuted in those circumstances when we all know that the people who are persecuted are often the ones who are without documentation, without the passport, without the permission of their country to leave?
Well, I think on this point, those that aren't documented, they cannot. Lord Blunkett, you've already mentioned if they've got visas, if they've got legal documentation. That is simply, not. And we do have a process. We have clear processes around asylum, and they are going to change to new plans for immigration. Our focus has to be on those that we want to give support to, we need to give support to, who are fleeing persecution, who are undocumented. We recognise that they are undocumented, but it is through, and you'll be familiar with many of the previous asylum processes, how we now change our interview processes, how we effectively ensure that we are granting asylum to those that are genuine asylum seekers, not those who turn up at primary control points, at our airports, and basically then effectively require special caseworking through Border Force to say, here I am with all my documentation and I'm here seeking asylum. That is simply not right. And that's why we are having these new processes, these new filters, because we as a country are warm, generous and welcoming, particularly to those who are fleeing persecution and need our help. And that is where we are concentrating our efforts through the new plan for immigration.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of time to come back to this, but I just get the impression that if you are properly documented and you've been able to come, in your terms, Home Secretary, legally, you'll not be granted asylum because you're clearly not at risk. Whereas if you're at risk and you've escaped and you don't have the documentation, you will not be admissible and you'll get temporary permission to be here. But we'll come back to it.
We will indeed. Most of us approach this from the other end, which is how if you are trying to get out of a country which is a conflict zone, you are able to get onto a regular means of transport. Home Secretary, I understand that there's a document outside which needs your signature.
Yes.
It's a good moment to regroup.
I will literally be very
But I think we might be able to get started, Tricia, if you're okay with this, on the next question, which is Baroness Pidding.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think the Home Secretary has already touched on part of this, but if I could just sort of follow up on about the meritorious claims, and how can we make sure that how those claims are going to be filtered, and how will that process account for the difficulties some claimants may have with engaging in the asylum process?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think the first point I would make is that we are really keen to improve the quality of service that we're able to offer people who are engaging with our asylum system, and we are in the middle of putting in place a program of reforms to make sure that we can deal with claims more quickly by making sure we have the right information to filter them into the right kind of decision processes with decision makers who've got the right kind of skills to deal with them. So we've developed a transformation program for our asylum caseworkers, which allows for more specialisation within the caseworking teams, so that they bring to their work more expert knowledge of individual countries. We've set them up to work in teams rather than on an individual basis, so they're able to give each other more peer support in making sure they've got the right information to take decisions. And we've also given them access to a external source of advice and support which isn't in their line management chain, so that if they're anxious about the quality of the evidence they're being provided or ethical considerations they're facing, they've got somebody who's independent to their team that they can look to for further advice and support. So we've got a fairly long way to go on that journey. I wouldn't say that at the minute we're happy with either the volumes of asylum cases that we're dealing with or with the productivity of our individual asylum decision makers, but over the next year or so we've got strong plans to bring more people into the team, to change the working model, to bring in more specialisation, to roll out team working. So I think that by the time, if we were sitting here next year, we would be able to describe a better, more effective service that we're offering.
Thank you.
Baroness Kennedy.
It's not going to surprise you. I'm going to ask you about legal advice and access to lawyers. One of the things is that it's been said that legal advice will be made available to claimants at the very beginning of the process, and I just wanted to know what practical arrangements there were for that.
Should I come in on that?
Yes.
So that's absolutely right. We believe that it's important to have legal advice up front.
As possible, yeah.
And as soon as possible. And there's been a great deal of consultation, as I'm sure all members will appreciate and recognise, because of the type of asylum claims that come forward. Mm-hmm. So I don't need to spell this out to the committee. Asylum is a deeply, deeply complicated area. And if I could just put this into some kind of context, In the year ending to March this year, the UK received the 4th largest number of asylum applications compared with EU member states. So that's 33,000 asylum applications. So in terms of legal support, members will be familiar with the right of appeal, not just once, not twice, but several times. We believe that access to legal aid as early as possible in the process, which legal aid is already there, will effectively introduce the ability to not just help to triage, but assess the needs and the background of the individual, because that's absolutely important. You know, we of course we all believe in doing right by those that need help and support, fleeing persecution, for example, and to give people all the support that they need, rather than dragging out claims, which is suboptimal for everybody in terms of outcomes. So we are looking at, and this is obviously policy work in progress. There are practical applications to our policy that we are looking at in terms of the arrangements, the amount of time, because time is important as well, obviously for claimants, particularly if they've got specialist needs. So if I may, just one particular specialist area is modern day slavery. Modern day slavery is a highly, highly complicated area. Now, knowing that members here are incredibly learned, many of you will be familiar with sort of some modern day slavery claims, but they vary. They're all case by case, they're very individual. It would not be right for me or anyone in government to sit and opine or generalise about what that claim could look like or what a claim could look like. So we are in the process of right now scoping out how that comes together, how it is effectively, how the triaging takes place, but how the access comes together for individuals. But of course that will take place literally very early on, almost as soon as people claim asylum. And then of course it's the triaging process that takes place from there.
What became clear from most of the research was that the reason why you were getting appeals was because of the absence of really good decision making at an early stage. And so if lawyers can be involved at an early stage, you get better decision making at the early stage, and it means less appealing. And so the success of the appeal rate was not because judges have developed soft hearts. It was because judges were seeing that the original decisions were poor and that there hadn't been adequate legal advice early on.
And we recognise that, and I myself have spent time with external counsel, various QCs, just to again listen and hear, because when you think about the immigration courts and tribunals, when we think about backlogs, for example, that'll be another subject for obviously a different department. It has a huge impact on individuals. 33,000 new applications, bottlenecks in the system, COVID and slower decision making. This drives terrible outcomes for people, and that's effectively what we are seeking to change and reform.
It's really good to hear you say that. One of the...
Can I just come in before you go on? Yes. I hope that the discussions about what it is really like for asylum seekers have included a trauma-informed approach, because I think we must all know that people who have been through these situations cannot begin to discuss them. I can't click my fingers, but just like that, it takes some investigation.
Particularly if it's been of a sexual nature, for example, for women, that it often takes time for them to be confident enough and trusting enough of the individuals who are questioning them before they'll disclose the full detail of what's happened to them.
You're both absolutely right, and notwithstanding the very significant reforms that we are bringing in, and they are significant, but I mean, quite frankly, we've got all sorts of issues within our system itself around the processing, but also why people come here illegally, then claim asylum. We want to do the right thing by the right people. But I have to say, I've been very, very cognizant and reflective of, and I've spent time, obviously, understanding cases. You spend time with people, human beings. The trauma is just extraordinary. Yeah. It is wrong of us to make generalisations in those early stages. It is therefore right that we put the right measures in place. And I would just like to emphasise this point, and I appreciate this will come up for further discussions in committee stages with the new plan for immigration and for the House and in the Lords as well. One of the most starkest areas for me, and in fact I've spoken to one of my predecessors about this, actually former Prime Minister Theresa May, are modern day slavery and bonded labour claims. They are astonishing, absolutely astonishing. People are so shattered and traumatised, and yet the system will automatically just make assumptions, you know, when actually that individual could also be pretty pivotal to a police investigation that could lead to prosecution. So how do we support them on that journey? So there are many, many considerations, and therefore I'm spending some time obviously with colleagues in the House right now as well, really asking not to just sort of generalise and overstate, you know, that it can all be done through binary solutions, because it can't be. We have to work with, you know, many of the tools that we are articulating and trying to advance.
That leads very readily into the next matter I wanted to raise with you, which was Wendy Williams conducted the review, which you've accepted in full. And she attributed the Windrush scandal to a culture of disbelief inside the Home Office. And it's something that many of us involved with the law have been aware of for rather a long time. And it's certainly we're talking about for decades, really. And you're designing this new plan, and I just wondered, how do you avoid risking a perpetuation of that? You know, it's one of the problems here. I mean, you're talking about not generalising.
Yes.
Is that business of automatically sort of assuming that people are going to lie, you know, starting with that point is problematic.
So I don't think we're starting from that premise at all. I mean, if I can just sort of, I'll come on to the wider point in a minute, but if I think about Windrush, obviously I walked into a department just as Windrush, the report, the lessons learned report, was due to come out. I have my own views, quite frankly. You know, I'm, you know, an ethnic minority Home Secretary coming into the department where, you know, it didn't feel that comfortable. I'm very upfront about that. I'm very, very honest about that as well. And so my work through Wendy Williams, and I met with Wendy last week, I've invited her back into the department because I believe that is the right approach. I really do, fundamentally. You know, because departments get institutionalised, right, in their thinking and their ways of working. And that happens everywhere. But there's no excuse to remember that my department deals with human beings. We deal with people. The premise of this government, I don't tire for saying we believe in putting people first. You know, we are democratically elected politicians, elected by the British public. Yes, they want change. Yes, they want reform. But it's also up to us to get under the bonnet and understand many of those sort of core components as to how we can serve people better. And that has always been integral to me, my instincts and my line of questioning the department, which has been challenging. I'll be very upfront. It's been difficult. I've had a lot of pushback. In many, many quarters. But that said, post the lessons learned report, which was harrowing, I mean, it is upsetting. It is very upsetting to read. It really is. It was upsetting for me to read it knowing that that was the department that I'm, you know, serving in and responsible for, and therefore seeking to bring about change. I think some big things have happened, which are cultural, but I think Trisha's also said on, you know, asylum, it doesn't happen overnight. This is a long haul. It really is. First of all, just understanding and recognising and respecting different people, different backgrounds, different faiths, different cultures. It's a statement of the obvious to all of us, but actually ensuring that that is also front and centre of people's minds. Now, it's easy for me to say that. Look at how ethnically diverse I am. I'm an internationalist. I've been brought up like that. And that speaks to my own personal values and my own family background. But you can again see in government, large government departments across government, you become very binary in your thinking, very silo-wise. Absolutely, I walked into all of that completely. So changing the culture through Wendy's work has been important. And with that, working with both my permanent secretaries, who have been excellent, I have to say, on this as well, recognising that we can't stand still as an organisation and as an institution. So I'm sure Trisha will come on to speak about some of the work we're doing with staff, etc. But specific to Wendy, we've got stakeholder groups, different forums. I'm a bring people in person. I apologise to no one about that. I quite like people. Open door, you know.
I'll come knocking looking at it.
Well, I appreciate for some,
I'm seeing this as an invitation.
Well, no, you should do. For some in politics, that might be a bit of an anathema, but not in our area. So we are historically, and I know Lord Blunkett will recognise this, we have been seen as a caseworking department. Well, actually, I'm also an elected representative. I don't talk about casework, I talk about people. And that's one of the biggest changes, I think, in our organisation. But then coming back to your overall point, new plan for immigration, this culture of disbelief, being challenging of the experiences. Why are we in court, for example? What is this case telling us? What have we not learnt about people's backgrounds? What's the situation or the circumstances? What has led to X outcome? There are lots of errors that still happen, and I'll be very candid and upfront about that. We end up in court for the wrong reasons too often, where we could have been better ourselves organisationally as a department. But as I've said, we are learning all the time. These reforms are difficult, not just in terms of policy and legislation, but also you'll appreciate this, absolutely, working with lawyers as well, where the law can be somewhat going down one avenue, where we need to think about other factors as well, and how do we take that much more blended approach.
We have our own cultural problems.
So and I think at this level, I think being open and honest and recognising that is really important, because the easier option would be saying nothing to see here, when actually, we could do a bit of stuff here, a bit of cosmetic stuff. I don't believe in that, which is why I accepted the recommendations, which was, they're not easy, they're absolutely not easy, but it's also a message back across the whole of government that fundamentally we represent the people, we serve the people, we're here for them. We have to take a very different approach going forward, but it's going to take a long time, it really is.
I wonder if I can...
How does that square, Chair, the people approach with treating people who have not come with the right documentation as inadmissible asylum seekers?
If I may, Lord Blunkett, on this, we also have to look at individual circumstances and backgrounds, based on what we know about individuals. I come back to my point, we can't just keep taking a sort of binary approach, sort of saying, that's it, you're in, you're not in. We have to, and it's complicated. Lord Blunkett, you will absolutely appreciate this and know this from your own work. That is why we put a lot of legal support in. That is why when you look at the work of border force, but also immigration enforcement, it's a whole work across the department, along with, yes, changes to our laws that will come, but how we treat people and how we work with people, how we respect them, how we need the time to understand what their circumstances are before we can, if they are here with no legal rights, remove them back to hopefully their own country, or if they're here under valid grounds in the way in which I've been speaking about, resettle them, start their new life, everything else that goes that way. But we have to have efficacy within our system, and that is core to some of the changes that we are bringing in.
I wonder, Home Secretary, whether I could just add a few words about that from a purely operational perspective, if that's okay, Chair. Just to make 3 points in addition to kind of what the Home Secretary has said. We may come on to this later on, but one of our absolute flagship actions that we've taken in our response to the Wendy Williams report has been the rollout of the Face Behind the Case learning package, which has now been undertaken by more than 10,000 of our staff, including those that are most involved in looking at individual cases and taking decisions. And we've just done a very rigorous evaluation of that training. It's not complete yet, but we've had incredibly positive feedback from our evaluation about the way in which that training has brought home to the people who are engaging with individuals the need to express themselves using simple language, to try and understand all dimensions of an individual's situation. And by far the majority of people who've gone on that course tell us that they're going to operate differently and think differently as a consequence of doing that training. So that's been a huge push for cultural change across our operational workforces. I think the second thing I would say, and I've been in the Home Office about a year and a half now, the cultural push to be more open to external voices and to bring people into the organisation who will say things about what we're doing that are not necessarily easy to hear or comfortable has been something that we've been particularly focusing on from an operational point of view. So we are almost at the end of Black History Month. We've had an extensive programme of speaker events in the organisation. Not all of those have been particularly comfortable moments, and we've had wide participation, but I think we are very keen for our operational workforces to hear, to feel comfortable with the complexity and conflict that's involved in their work, and to see that as being, that's not something that needs to be resisted. It's something that which is an intrinsic part of the job we're asking people to do.
Thank you. Wendy Williams' recommendations extended to the internal culture of the Home Office. I attended an online briefing about this fairly early on during lockdown, and we heard about 360-degree appraisals, how those were being introduced. I just wondered how extensive they are, how far up the organisation they've gone. Have you undergone one?
So I've got a private sector background, and I've been pushing 360 reviews. It's fair to say from day one, from the day that I entered the department, I value them, and they work across the board, they really do. And it's fair to say, Tricia will expand upon this more, but we spend a great deal of time in terms of...
Well, I don't particularly want to spend a lot of time on it because I've got other policy things, but I'm really interested to know whether you've taken part in this.
Well, I have, because I'm constantly under review in my own department, formally, as well as with colleagues. I mean, that is effectively how it works, completely.
And from an official's perspective, Chair, can I just be really clear that I've had 360 feedback twice a year. Matthew Rycroft is the other permanent secretary. We have 360 feedback. It's now a mandatory part of the system for all senior leaders across the whole of the organisation. Yeah. And baked into that, and I think this is something I'm really keen to tell you, is feedback not just from our immediate people we work with immediately, but from our operational workforces as well. So we get feedback twice a year on what's the quality of our leadership, what's the quality of our delivery of the cultural change we're trying to do, and that's a very, very important thing to us.
Thank you. I'll move on to Lord Delakia.
Thank you. Home Secretary, can I come back on the matter of resources and reception centres? The Home Office intends to accommodate asylum seekers who could have sought refuge in some of the safe countries. The same thing applies in relation to detainees whose removal is possible within a reasonable time. The question arises, how many people are you expecting to be accommodating or detaining in a typical year, and how much are you expecting that to cost?
Well, first of all, just on future accommodation. So I'm very much looking at reception centres as part of our future accommodation plans. Primarily, it is public knowledge, it is a well-known fact that currently we have been housing asylum seekers in hotels. There are a number of reasons for that. The pandemic. So Tricia can speak much more about the dialogue with Public Health England. Because of Public Health England guidance through the pandemic, we were unable to continue with asylum accommodation in the way in which I'm sure committee members have been familiar with. So we've ended up having to put people into a hotel accommodation, and I'm afraid I think that's completely suboptimal. It is counterproductive. I think it's also acted as a pull factor for people to come to the country illegally, thinking that they're going to end up in hotels. So the point about reception centres is that we, through the new plan for immigration, will fundamentally change the way in which we accommodate people, and also provide the right kind of accommodation with the right kind of needs for people, so that people do not also end up becoming destitute, so that they are fully housed, they are taken care of, they're given the medical support, they're given the welfare support, all under one roof. And then importantly with that, we can process their claims in one place, so that they themselves can see how their claims are being processed in a way in which they can't right now. And we know for a fact through our reporting centres, and our reporting centres were not able to function during the pandemic because we were locked up because of lockdown and all those kinds of things. We know for a fact that one of the greatest frustration of people that claim asylum is that they simply do not hear about their case progression. So we want to be able to run all these services and have an end-to-end approach to the asylum case handling and how asylum seekers are treated, so that they're in one place and their needs are met. Now, you've asked about numbers, I can't sit here and tell you numbers right now, because for obvious reasons, we haven't got a reception centre right now. We are going back to dispersed accommodation now that the guidance has changed around COVID, which takes time to move people on. The system is very sluggish, it's difficult. We have to work with local councils, local authorities and things of that nature, which clearly that is an operational aspect that the department is working on. But specifically to reception centres, we would look to, and we're looking at various models. Tricia might want to speak about this, but this will also go through a procurement process in terms of numbers, how they'll be structured, the type of needs that we have to cater for. That is obviously work in progress that will be linked to the new plan for immigration and the legislation we're bringing forward.
If you don't mind, I'm not going to ask Tricia to come in on this because, that's detail we can come up
Yes,
back
my
to
supplementary
later.
question was, how much of these centres are likely to receive proper health and safety regulations? Because in the past you've been criticised very badly on the way the people are treated in some of these centres.
So I will be very frank about this. We are talking and speaking about new build centres. So there would absolutely be, I would see them, I'm not even going to say in line with, but over and above health and safety standards. I've already referenced, we'd have welfare facilities, medical facilities, everything in place. And if I may, Lord Delaca, you're probably referring to Napier Barracks, which again was stood up, not our accommodation, it's not our accommodation. It became a site that we took over, an MOD site, where we effectively had to convert it. That was work in progress, and we're very upfront about that. In terms of the changes that we have brought in, the investments that have gone in, and the welfare and the support care that has gone in as well. That was during the time of the pandemic, at a time when we simply did not have accommodation that would meet COVID needs. And we, as we've remarked before, we were working with the guidance and Public Health England throughout all of that.
I had a further question on the bilateral arrangements. You mentioned India in your conversation. I had a number of politicians from India who had been in touch with me. They don't accept that there is a bilateral arrangement of the type that you mentioned, because the arrangement is you take the detainees from this country who are people who are going to return back, who are illegal in this country, at the expense of those who are qualified people who could be accommodated in the United Kingdom. Is that the type of arrangement you've
That's
secured?
not the case at all. No, we have a mobility partnership with the government-to-government mobility partnership, and it is based absolutely, and it was signed in May this year with the MEA, so the Ministry for External Affairs, which was absolutely based on, we've got a youth mobility partnership with India, which is obviously about giving new opportunities for young Indian professionals to come and live and work in the UK, and it's a reciprocal arrangement for us as well. But there is a recognition, I think all credit to the government of India, that they recognise that they have a high number of Indian nationals in the United Kingdom with no legal basis to be in the United Kingdom, and they've been very, very clear. This was signed by the MEA, but it is led by the Home Ministry, that they will accept people, Indian nationals, its own nationals, not detained nationals, own nationals, who obviously we then bring through a process through immigration enforcement. We detain them, then we remove them. That is collaboration, and it is joint collaboration. It's not binary in one way at all. It's joint collaboration with a full commitment to work with the Indian government, both in India and in the UK through the Indian High Commission, on providing the documentation, travel documentation, and the authorisations through the High Commission to make sure that those that people can be returned back to India.
I wonder whether Lord Delaca can be in direct touch with you by correspondence after this, because clearly he's hearing different.
Sure, very happy to, of course.
Baroness Chakrabarty.
Thank you, Home Secretary. It's quite good in a way to come a little later into the session, because I've been able to kind of listen to your answers, your previous